The unseen journey begins. The hum of the airplane engines echoed through the first-class cabin, a constant, comforting sound that seemed to almost lull the passengers into a false sense of calm. Barron Trump, the 18-year-old son of the then President of the United States, reclined in his seat, his hands resting casually on the armrests, his eyes scanning through the window. The luxurious leather of his seat seemed to hug him just right, and the familiar scent of expensive cologne filled the air. His security detail, ever present, stood at attention nearby. It was supposed to be a routine flight, just another long-distance trip, until an unexpected event unfolded that would change the course of the entire journey. As Barron settled into the tranquility of his surroundings, something unusual caught his attention. A commotion at the front of the cabin. His gaze shifted, and his sharp eyes fixed on the scene. The flight attendant, a young woman who had been graceful and poised just moments before, was now speaking in hushed, flustered tones to a tall, rugged figure who stood in the doorway. Barron squinted, his curiosity piqued. The man, clad in a cowboy hat and a look of quiet authority, seemed oddly familiar. "Is that Chuck Norris?" Barron thought, his pulse quickening. The legendary martial artist, the man who had inspired countless movies and television shows, the icon of resilience and strength. What was he doing here? Chuck Norris stood at the entrance of the plane, holding a boarding pass in his hand, looking around in mild confusion. The flight attendant, clearly flustered, was explaining something, but her words were lost to Barron as he watched the interaction unfold. The cabin was filled with a few murmurs, and then Barron overheard something that made his blood run cold. "First class is overbooked," the flight attendant explained, her voice barely audible, "and it seems there's no seat for Mr. Norris." The murmurs grew louder. How could someone like Chuck Norris, a legend in his own right, be left without a seat in first class? Barron's mind raced. This wasn't just a man. This was a symbol of something greater: strength, honor, resilience. But he had been forgotten. He had been treated like just another passenger. A sudden sense of empathy rose in Barron's chest, something powerful that he couldn't explain. Without even thinking about it, without hesitation, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. The whispers grew louder as Barron walked to the front of the cabin, his footsteps firm and purposeful. "Mr. Norris," Barron said, his voice steady but warm, "please take my seat." The entire cabin fell silent. Even the flight attendants and his security team seemed momentarily stunned. Barron's gesture was simple, yet profound. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about something deeper. It was about respect, about honoring someone who had paved the way for so many, and about recognizing that even legends deserve a moment of kindness. Chuck Norris stood there, his gaze shifting from Barron's earnest expression to the seat Barron had just vacated. A deep, unspoken respect passed between them, something that words couldn't convey. He took a step forward, but before he could sit down, he placed a hand firmly on Barron's shoulder. "Son," Chuck Norris said, his voice low and measured, "do you know what you've just done?" Barron blinked, confused. "I just gave up my seat, sir. I figured it was the right thing to do." Chuck's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he were considering something deeper than the surface level of the exchange. "You did more than that," he replied, his voice carrying a weight of wisdom. "What you've done is rare, and I need to speak to you about it." At first, Barron didn't understand. He had thought he was just being polite, just doing something good. But something about Chuck's demeanor, his tone, his gaze, told him that this wasn't just about a seat. There was something bigger at play, something more significant. Chuck motioned for them to move into the private lounge area at the front of first class. Barron's security detail looked at each other uncertainly, but Chuck's presence alone seemed to calm them. Even the toughest agents respected the martial arts icon. As they stepped into the lounge, the door clicked shut behind them, and the world outside seemed to fade into a blur. Chuck's voice dropped to a whisper as he turned to Barron. "This flight isn't normal," he said, his eyes scanning the room. There's something bigger going on here, something that's about to unfold. And by giving up your seat, you've already become part of it." Barron's heart raced. The weight of Chuck's words settled into him like a heavy burden. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Chuck sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. "I wasn't supposed to be on this flight. I got a call. Someone important is in danger. And now, so are you." Barron's stomach dropped. This wasn't just a random act of kindness. This was the beginning of something much bigger, something much more dangerous than either of them could have predicted. Before Barron could respond, a sharp voice crackled through Chuck's earpiece. "Eagle has landed. Confirm status." Chuck's face hardened instantly. His posture straightened, and his demeanor shifted, the calm, legendary figure now replaced by someone focused and resolute. "We have a problem," he said, his voice dark with intensity. Barron felt his pulse quicken. He had been trained for high-pressure situations, but nothing had prepared him for this. He had just given up his seat for Chuck Norris, a simple act of kindness, and now he was caught up in something that could be dangerous beyond his comprehension. "Tell me the truth, Mr. Norris," Barron said, his voice steady, despite the knot in his stomach. "What's happening?" Chuck exhaled sharply, his eyes narrowing as he looked Barron in the eye. "There's a high-profile target on this plane, and I think we're about to face something dangerous." Barron's thoughts raced. Was this just some elaborate conspiracy? Was there someone on board with a plan to harm them? He didn't know, but one thing was certain. Chuck Norris had just revealed that their flight had turned into something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. And just as Barron was about to ask more questions, the plane suddenly jolted, and the lights flickered above them. A gasp echoed from the cabin, and Barron's blood ran cold. Something had just happened. Something that was only the beginning. The hum of the engines became louder, more oppressive. The passengers were starting to panic, their fear palpable in the air. The turbulence intensified, and Barron's security agents sprang into action, securing the area and keeping a close eye on the passengers. But Chuck Norris remained still, his eyes scanning the cabin with a sharpness that betrayed years of experience. He knew something was wrong. "Something's off," he muttered under his breath. Barron gripped the armrest, his heart hammering in his chest. The flight attendants, once calm and collected, now moved hurriedly down the aisles, attempting to reassure the passengers. But Barron could see the fear spreading like wildfire. It was too late for reassurances. Whatever was happening, it had already begun. The story continues as Barron and Chuck Norris uncover more about the mystery that has thrust them into an unimaginable situation. Stay tuned to discover how they handle the looming threat, showing resilience, strength, and determination to protect everyone on board. The storm within the skies. The airplane's cabin shook once more, a violent tremor that sent ripples through the passengers. Gasps filled the air as lights flickered overhead, casting unsettling shadows on the otherwise peaceful faces of the first-class passengers. Barron Trump's breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding in his chest as he clung to his seat. This was no ordinary turbulence. This was the kind of shake that spoke of something more ominous, something more dangerous than the mechanics of a simple storm. Chuck Norris stood unmoved, his eyes scanning every corner of the cabin. He was no stranger to danger, no stranger to chaos. But Barron could see it now, a flicker of something deeper in Chuck's gaze, something that suggested they were on the brink of a confrontation that neither of them had bargained for. The air in the cabin was thick, heavy with a sense of impending doom. The flight attendants, previously calm, now hurriedly checked the safety equipment, their movements rushed and almost frantic. Barron's Secret Service agents had already moved into position, taking strategic spots in the aisles, their eyes darting to and fro as they monitored the passengers. Their expressions were grim. Something had triggered a shift, and it wasn't just the turbulence. Chuck's hand tightened around the back of the seat in front of him. He leaned in slightly, his voice barely a whisper as he spoke to Barron. I've been around this long enough to know when something's about to go wrong. And I've got a bad feeling about this." Barron nodded, the weight of Chuck's words settling in his chest like lead. He had been trained for political pressure, for public appearances, but nothing had prepared him for the kind of pressure that was mounting now. The feeling of unease intensified, and for the first time, Barron began to wonder if his life, his entire future, was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly anticipate. Suddenly, another jolt hit the plane, and a scream echoed from the back of the cabin. Barron's eyes snapped to the source of the noise, his body tensing instinctively. A woman in economy class had risen from her seat, her face pale, her eyes wide with panic. She staggered down the aisle, her hands trembling as she gripped the armrests for support. The flight attendants rushed to her side, attempting to calm her, but the fear was spreading. "Keep calm. Please, return to your seats," one of the flight attendants called out, but her voice cracked under the strain. The tension in the cabin was thick now, almost suffocating. Chuck's gaze locked on the woman for a moment, his eyes narrowing. Something wasn't right. His instincts, honed by years of experience, were telling him there was more to this than simple turbulence. And then, as if on cue, another flight attendant hurried down the aisle, her expression more strained than before. "I need to speak to you both, Mr. Trump, Mr. Norris," she said, her voice rushed, her face drained of color. There's something you need to know." Barron stood, his body moving instinctively as the flight attendant led them to a small private cabin within first class. Chuck Norris followed without hesitation, his eyes still scanning every face, every corner of the plane. There was no time to waste. Something was brewing, and it wasn't going to wait for them to figure it out. Inside the small lounge, the flight attendant closed the door behind them, her breath shaky as she faced them. "There's a man," she started, her voice trembling, "in economy class. He's been acting suspicious. He switched seats twice, refused to show his identification when asked, and just before the turbulence started, he walked toward the cockpit." Barron's stomach tightened. A passenger acting like that, under these conditions, was no coincidence. His eyes met Chuck's, and for a brief moment, the room felt colder. Chuck's jaw clenched. "We need to act fast," he muttered under his breath, his voice cold with a sense of urgency. "That's no coincidence. We need to find him before he makes a move." Barron felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders like a storm cloud. This wasn't just about giving up a seat. This wasn't just a small act of kindness. This was real. This was danger, and it was closing in fast. With a nod from Chuck, Barron turned to the flight attendant. "Where exactly is he?" The attendant hesitated for a moment before answering, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's seated near the front of economy, near the left aisle. But please, you need to be careful. I don't know if he's alone." Without another word, Chuck moved quickly, his steps decisive and swift. Barron followed closely behind, his mind racing with possibilities. Was this man really a threat, or had he simply been a victim of the same turbulence that had unsettled the entire plane? Either way, Barron knew one thing for sure. He couldn't afford to wait. They had to act. The air seemed to grow thicker as they moved down the aisle, the sounds of the passengers' murmurs filling the space between them. Barron's mind raced with the realization that whatever was happening wasn't just random. It wasn't just bad luck or coincidence. This was something calculated, something deliberate. When they reached the man's seat, Chuck took the lead, his presence commanding and unyielding. The man, his hood pulled low over his face, sat rigidly, his hands clutching his phone so tightly that his knuckles were white. His breathing was shallow, rapid. His entire body tensed, as if he were preparing for something. Chuck's voice cut through the tension, firm and authoritative. "Excuse me, sir. Mind telling me where you're headed?" The man didn't answer, his eyes glued to the screen of his phone, his fingers tapping nervously on the glass. Barron felt a chill settle in his bones. This wasn't a random passenger. This was someone who was hiding something. Clint, one of Barron's Secret Service agents, leaned forward. "Sir, we need to see your identification," he said, his voice steady but firm. The man slowly looked up, his eyes wild with panic. The mask of composure he had been wearing cracked in that moment, and Barron saw fear, not just fear for himself, but something more, something deeper. The man was afraid of something that wasn't in his control. He reached into his jacket pocket too quickly. "Hands where I can see them," Clint barked, his hand hovering near his weapon. The cabin fell into a stunned silence as the flight attendants backed away, their faces pale with fear. The man, now visibly trembling, reached into his jacket and dropped a small black device onto the floor. The moment the device hit the floor, Barron felt his stomach drop. He didn't need to know what it was to understand that it was bad. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening. The man lunged for the device, but Chuck was faster. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it just enough to force him to drop the device again. A small metallic click echoed as it bounced against the floor. Chuck Norris's voice was low, menacing. "Who sent you?" he growled. The man's eyes filled with tears. His body shook uncontrollably, and he fell to his knees. "I swear, I wasn't going to do it," he sobbed. "I was forced. They have my daughter. They told me. They told me if I didn't plant the device, they'd kill her before I landed." Barron's blood ran cold as the weight of the situation sank in. This wasn't about terrorism or political intrigue. This was a desperate father who had been forced to make a choice no parent should ever have to make. Barron's voice trembled as he spoke, his heart heavy with the realization of what was at stake. "What's your daughter's name?" he asked, his words barely above a whisper. "Emma," the man choked out. "She's only 6. Barron swallowed hard, his throat constricting. He turned to Chuck, his voice fierce and determined. "We need to find her. We need to save her." Chuck's gaze hardened, his eyes steely with resolve. "We will. But first, we need to stop this plane from becoming a weapon." As the cabin around them fell silent, a sense of purpose settled over Barron. He had no idea what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let this man's daughter die. They had come too far to fail now. The clock was ticking, and the stakes were higher than ever. The ticking clock. The tension in the airplane cabin was almost unbearable as the reality of the situation set in. Barron Trump stood at the front of the plane, his mind racing with thoughts of the desperate man and his daughter, Emma. The weight of the world seemed to rest on his shoulders as he tried to process what was unfolding. A father, forced into an unimaginable position, had brought a deadly device onto the plane, one that could threaten the lives of everyone on board. But Barron wasn't just any passenger. He wasn't going to sit back and allow tragedy to strike without a fight. Chuck Norris, ever the picture of calm and strength, moved with precision as he continued to assess the situation. His hands were steady as he studied the small black device that had been dropped on the floor. Barron could sense that the martial arts legend was formulating a plan, thinking several steps ahead. "We have to get the device off this plane," Chuck said, his voice low but filled with determination. "But we also have to make sure that the kidnappers don't get what they want. Time is running out." Barron nodded, his mind a blur of thoughts and emotions. The thought of a 6-year-old girl, held hostage by ruthless criminals, was enough to fuel a surge of adrenaline within him. The stakes were no longer about his safety or the safety of the passengers. This was about saving Emma's life. This was about taking action when it mattered most. Chuck's eyes narrowed as he examined the device. "This isn't just a simple explosive," he said, his voice laced with experience. "It's a tracking device. Whoever planted this on the plane is watching every move we make. If they think we're trying to disable it, they'll trigger the plan and put the entire plane in danger." Barron felt a chill run through him. The realization hit like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a race against time to save a child. It was a high-stakes game of deception and strategy. They were playing against an unseen enemy who had already anticipated their every move. The thought that they were being watched made his blood run cold. "So what do we do?" Barron asked, his voice steady despite the rising panic inside him. Chuck exhaled deeply, his sharp gaze scanning the room, taking in every detail. "We turn the tables. We have to give them a reason to think the device is already deactivated. We have to make them believe they've won, at least long enough for us to figure out a way to find Emma." Barron wasn't sure exactly how they would pull it off, but he trusted Chuck Norris. He had seen the man take down seemingly insurmountable odds before, and now Barron had to do his part. "We need to get to the cockpit," Chuck said, his eyes sharp with purpose. "We need to take control of the situation before it escalates any further." Barron followed him as they moved through the narrow aisles of the plane. The flight attendants had retreated to the back, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. The passengers were whispering amongst themselves, trying to make sense of the strange and unsettling events that had unfolded so far. As they reached the cockpit door, Barron's heart raced. He knew they had to act quickly, but what exactly was their next move? The situation had spiraled out of control so fast that it was hard to keep track of the pieces, but one thing was certain: they couldn't afford to wait any longer. The cockpit door was locked, but Chuck didn't hesitate. He placed his hand on the handle and gave it a firm twist. The door swung open, revealing the flight crew, who were visibly shaken but still composed. "Mr. Norris," the captain said, his voice tight with stress. "What's going on? Is there a threat on this plane?" Chuck's eyes hardened. "Yes," he replied, his voice steady. "There is, but we can't let the passengers know yet. We need to keep them calm for as long as possible." Barron stepped forward, his mind focused. "We need to make an emergency landing," he said, his voice unwavering. "But we can't let anyone know that it's not just because of the turbulence. We need to give them a reason to believe the device is under control." The captain's brow furrowed. "But how do we do that without putting everyone at risk?" Chuck glanced at Barron, his eyes locked with the young man's for a moment. "We have to fake it. We need to send a signal that makes them think we've already deactivated the device. We can't let them know that we're still working on a way to find Emma." The captain's face paled, but he nodded. "Understood. We'll do what we can." Barron could see the urgency in their eyes, but he could also see that Chuck's leadership had given them a sense of direction. They had a plan, one that was risky and fraught with uncertainty, but it was the only chance they had. And with every passing second, the clock was ticking. The aircraft began its descent, the rumble of the engines filling the cabin as Barron, Chuck, and the flight crew continued to work in the cockpit, preparing for the emergency landing. Barron's mind raced as he thought about Emma. How could they possibly find her before it was too late? What if they didn't get there in time? Chuck had his hand on the intercom, speaking with the ground crew, relaying their plan. "We need an immediate response. The device is still active, and we're not sure how far along they are in their operation. The kidnappers are monitoring our every move. They're waiting for us to slip up." Barron watched as Chuck gave the orders with a quiet intensity. The man had seen it all, the darkest corners of the world, the most dangerous situations, and yet here he was, calm as ever, holding the fate of the passengers, and more importantly, the little girl, in his hands. The plane's descent grew steeper, and Barron's heart hammered in his chest. He couldn't shake the image of Emma's tear-streaked face, her small frame trembling in fear. He thought of the man, her father, who had been pushed to his limits, his hand shaking as he tried to carry out the impossible task he had been given. How could anyone be expected to choose between their own life and the life of their child? As the plane neared the runway, the ground crew began to position themselves, preparing for the emergency landing. The city below was a blur of lights, a chaotic mix of activity. Barron's breath came in shallow gasps as he clenched his fists. They had one shot at this, one opportunity to make things right. There was no turning back now. The captain's voice came over the intercom. and the passengers, who had been anxiously awaiting some resolution, were instructed to brace for impact. Barron held onto his seat as the wheels of the plane made contact with the tarmac, the screeching sound of rubber against asphalt echoing through the cabin. The moment they landed, Chuck Norris was already on his feet, his hand on Barron's shoulder. "This is where the real fight begins," he said, his voice low but filled with purpose. "We're not just saving a plane. We're saving a life. And we're going to do whatever it takes." Barron's pulse was racing, but there was a fire inside him now. A fire fueled by determination, by the need to protect. He wasn't just the son of a president. He was a man who would fight for what was right, no matter the cost. And with that, they stepped off the plane, ready to face whatever danger lay ahead. The final showdown had begun. The price of courage. The emergency landing had barely come to a stop when the ground crew and security teams sprang into action, moving with military precision. Barron Trump and Chuck Norris, flanked by Barron's Secret Service agents, stepped onto the tarmac with a single goal in mind: saving Emma. The night air was crisp, sharp with tension, and every step they took felt like a countdown to something monumental. The kidnappers were watching. Barron could feel the weight of their presence as he scanned the airport, his mind still reeling from the events that had transpired. The airport was a flurry of movement, yet there was a strange stillness in the air, the calm before a storm. Barron's heart hammered in his chest as they moved toward the hangar where the kidnappers were reportedly waiting. But he didn't falter. He wasn't alone. He had Chuck, his agents, and more importantly, he had something far more powerful than any weapon: determination. "Stay close," Chuck murmured to Barron, his voice steady. "We can't let them see us coming. The element of surprise is our best weapon." Barron nodded, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had no illusions about the dangers they were about to face. The kidnappers were ruthless. They had proven that when they threatened Emma's life to force her father's compliance. But Barron wasn't going to let fear dictate his actions. He wasn't going to let fear stop him from fighting for an innocent life. As they approached the designated hangar, a figure in the distance caught Barron's eye. A man standing with his arms crossed, watching them approach. His face was hidden behind dark sunglasses, his demeanor calm, too calm. The moment they stepped closer, he raised his hand and gestured for them to stop. "This is as far as you go," the man said coldly, his voice deep and threatening. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Barron stepped forward, his voice unwavering. "I'm dealing with the safety of a child. That's all that matters right now. And I'm not going to let you take her life." The man's lips curled into a grim smile. "You think you can stop us? We've been planning this for a long time. You're too late." Barron's mind raced. This was it, the moment that would determine whether Emma lived or died. He could feel the fear coursing through him. But it wasn't the fear of failure that gripped him. It was the fear of the consequences if they didn't act now. He thought back to the father, the man who had been forced to make a gut-wrenching decision. He thought of Emma, alone and afraid, waiting for someone to save her. Chuck Norris moved forward, his presence powerful. The man with the sunglasses hesitated for a moment. But Chuck's unspoken authority was enough to stop him in his tracks. "You don't have to do this," Chuck said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable force. "This isn't the way." The man scoffed, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "You think it's that simple, that I'll just walk away?" Chuck shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the man. "I don't need you to walk away. I need you to stop hurting innocent people." For a moment, the air was still. Then, without warning, the sound of sirens blared in the distance. Reinforcements had arrived. Agents from the local security forces had taken positions around the perimeter. The kidnappers were surrounded. Realization dawned on the man's face, and for the first time, Barron saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The power had shifted. The game was over. Chuck moved swiftly, disarming the man with a single decisive motion. "You're done," he said. "It's over." As the man was restrained and taken into custody, Barron felt a weight lift off his chest. They had done it. They had saved Emma. Later that night, as Barron sat in the quiet of the airport lounge, the phone call he had been waiting for finally came. It was the father, his voice trembling with gratitude. "Barron, I don't know how to thank you," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my daughter. You saved my little girl." Barron's throat tightened. "No thanks are necessary. It's what anyone would do." The father's voice cracked, and Barron could hear the sound of a child's laughter in the background. "You don't understand," the man said, his voice filled with relief. "You gave us back our future. You gave us a second chance." As Barron hung up the phone, he realized something profound. The world was full of moments where people were forced to choose between doing what was easy and doing what was right. It wasn't always the right choice that won. But in that moment, in that flight, he had chosen the hard path, the path that led to sacrifice, to courage, and ultimately, to a future worth living. He had stepped into a situation far beyond the life he had known, a life of privilege, security, and ease. But in the face of danger, he had made a choice. He had chosen to stand up for what was right, even when it meant risking everything. And in doing so, he had made a difference. Chuck Norris, who had been by his side through it all, stood next to him, his calm demeanor never faltering. "You did good, kid," he said simply. Barron smiled, feeling the weight of the experience settle into his bones. "We did good. All of us." It wasn't just about one person doing the right thing. It was about a community of people, those who stood up for others, those who didn't hesitate when it was time to act, those who believed in something greater than themselves. That was the true lesson he had learned that day. It wasn't about the spotlight or the recognition. It was about making a difference in the lives of others, even in the most unexpected of circumstances. Barron turned to Chuck, a sense of gratitude rising in his chest. "Thank you. I never would have made it through this without you." Chuck nodded, his expression unreadable but his eyes soft with understanding. "You didn't have to. You had it in you all along. Sometimes it just takes a moment to realize who you really are." As the night wore on and the tension of the day began to fade, Barron sat back, reflecting on the incredible journey that had unfolded before him. The lessons he had learned, the decisions he had made, and the courage that had carried him through it all were now part of who he was. And in the end, Barron understood that the true measure of a person wasn't found in titles, wealth, or privilege. It was found in the choices they made when faced with adversity. It was found in their willingness to fight for others, to protect what was innocent and pure, and to stand tall even when the odds seemed insurmountable. As the plane began its return journey, Barron looked out the window at the vast expanse of the sky. He knew that there would be more challenges ahead, more moments where he would have to choose. But now he was ready, and he knew one thing for certain. No matter what came next, he would always choose to do what was right. And that was a lesson worth carrying for a lifetime. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.